Welcome to the first episode of a feature I'm going to be calling Unsolicited Podcast Feedback. Possible work in progress title.
Unsolicited podcast feedback. Unsolicited podcast feedback. Is your show doing all the basics right? Or is your show just the wrong side of chat?
The idea of this is we're going to take a look through the top 25 UK podcast charts and offer some very unsolicited free feedback to that podcast. Very much the same way that we might be offering feedback to a Podknows client with a podcast audit. Except not quite as nice, because these people are famous and need tearing down joking. So as you'll see, I have this roulette wheel with the names of all the podcasts eligible for this feature mentioned. Let's give it a click and see where we end up. All right, the news agents with Emily Maitlis, John Sopel, and Lewis Woodall. If you're not from the UK and you don't know who these people are, they are very highly respected journalists. Emily Maitlis, obviously famous for that interview that she did with Prince Andrew, which resulted in two movies, in fact, or two TV movies about the event. So she's quite well known in the UK. Probably less so outside of the UK. I've been aware of the news agents as a podcast for a couple of years now, but I could count on one hand the amount of episodes I've listened to. In fact, I don't think I've listened to a full one. So this is going to be interesting for me to actually hear what all the fuss is about when it comes to this podcast. Just to clarify what this is about, I am going to listen to just a few minutes of this. I think it's around about 35 minutes long, the actual episode. I'm not going to listen to all 35 minutes, so don't worry about that. I'm going to listen with you, and we're going to pick up on some of the things that we're getting from the audio. Is there anything that could be done better? Is there anything that is great and more people should be doing? So let's get into it, shall we?
The News Agents podcast is brought to you by HSBC UK, opening up a world of opportunity.
Okay, let's start off straight away, because this is quite an interesting point, actually, when it comes to the lens of a big podcast, News Agents. I mean, it's got millions of listeners. It makes a lot of money for Global. Global are a big company that make the show. They own radio stations, Global. They do the advertising billboards. They've got a lot of revenue, and they have got a lot of financial resources to invest in a podcast. The difference between them and pretty much every other everyday podcaster is that they can afford to turn new listeners off with ads. Okay, and it was a very short ad, actually. As far as podcast ads go, it was pretty impressive. Like, straight to the point. Emily, we know her voice. Straight in, straight out. It wasn't a particularly memorable ad, and, I'm already forgetting who was advertising to. I think it was a bank. My point being that they can afford the churn of listeners because they're getting financial rewards of huge amounts off the back of it. You, unless you've got millions of downloads per episode per week, and your ads are making you a shit ton of money, I would always be advising on avoiding having such an ad at the very beginning of your episode. It's just going to be a real stunt to your growth.
This is a Global Player original podcast.
Okay, so we got the self-interest again here. We've got the actual production company that are giving themselves a big shout out. This is a global production. Okay, who cares? The listener doesn't really care. I think having the Global Player logo on the artwork is fine. I think even having something, a Sonic logo somewhere in the episode is fine. Does it need to be the first thing? Global will argue that it does, because their self-interest is at play here. They want you to know it's them that have made this podcast. It's them that own this podcast. But What they're forgetting is that most listeners will not care who, there will be some brand equity with some, like Goalhanger Productions, Gary Lineker's podcast company, definitely, people will associate that podcast company with a certain level of quality. So I understand why Global would want to put that in there. They want people to listen to it and go, oh, this is a global podcast. Oh, okay, then it's going to be a decent level of quality if they've not heard of the show before. However, for the listener, for the everyday, for the new listener, they're not going to care. And I would argue moving that later on would probably be beneficial. Let's carry on listening.
The ayes to the right, 330. The noes to the left, 275. The ayes have it, and look!
Okay, so we're now, what's that, nearly 30 seconds into the episode, 23 seconds into the episode. And we don't know what this is about yet. I mean, we do if we look at the title. Obviously, it's there. History in Parliament. MPs say yes to assisted dying. If we've read the description, when the vote in the Commons came back, you could have heard a pin drop. In the end, after hours of debate, the result was conclusive. 330 MPs voting yes to assisted dying. What I want you to think about is not everybody is going to be able to look at the title of the podcast's episode. They might be driving. They might have their playlist on automation, in which case it goes from episode to episode to episode. They might have just listened to a completely unrelated podcast. They don't even know necessarily that this is the news agents yet, other than Emily Maitlis has been heard on it doing the ad for the bank, and they've had, this is a global production. So they probably have an idea, yeah, okay, this is probably news agents actually. But they don't know the topic yet. They've not been told. And they've heard some out-of-context audio that's suboptimal quality. They might still be in that mind of, I've got the Apple CarPlay right in front of me. Do I hit next? Do I skip? Just be mindful of that.
There aren't, in fact, that many truly historic votes in the House of Commons chamber, despite what we journalists might like to tell you sometimes.
30 seconds in.
When one does come along, and when you're in the chamber, you can feel it. And today's vote on assisted dying for terminally ill people doubtless was one of them.
40 seconds it took us to find out what this episode is about. Let's just park that for a second.
Could feel it. And you could tell by one very simple measure, which you've just heard, which was as the votes were called out, almost totally exceptionally for the Commons, and almost totally exceptionally for a winning side. The winning side was almost entirely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. No cheer, no shouting from the sidelines, not even really a murmur. All you could feel was the solemnity, the somber nature of the House, because yes or no, they all knew that the House of Commons had made its decision and its feeling known, it was in favour, and that would be a first in our history. For the first time...
I'm going to pick up on something here which a few people might not actually be able to pick up on, and that is, it feels, I don't know how this was recorded, I wasn't there, I didn't witness it, but it feels like he's just waffling. And I know that the intention was probably to be there and set the scene, paint a little bit of colour for us that were not privy to the debate. We're not there to see this all playing out in front of us. He is the voice of that experience. But it just sounds like he's waffling. It just sounds like he's riffing this off the top of his head. And I'm not entirely sure I feel comfortable with that presentation given the topic.
There is still a long way to go, but by a majority of 55, the House of Commons has said that it is in favour of assisted dying. What does it mean? Where do we go from here? Are we on the verge of the biggest social change in this country since the 1960s? Welcome to the News Agents.
Okay, so we are now more than a minute into the episode. In fact, we are nearly 2 minutes into the episode, and we've finally been told what the show is. And we've finally been given a bit of an idea of what the episode's going to be about.
The newsagents.
This bill will give society a much better
And we're back to historic audio.
approach towards end of life. We're already seeing conversations about dying and death in a way that we haven't seen, I don't think, enough in this country.
The truth is, if we vote against her bill today, it will be the end of the conversation once again for another decade.
You can hear some ambient audio is now creeping in. We've got historic audio, we've got random voices. Obviously, this was during the actual discussion in the comments, and what they've done is they've stuck some almost slightly tension-building dramatic audio under those voices, because the mindset on this has clearly been, right, okay, this is a debate. It's not the most exciting content in the world, to which I would say, why include it? Certainly in that context, why include it? If you know that this audio needs something behind it to give it its place, why include it? I don't know about you, but I'm not scrolling through the channels on television till I get to Parliament Channel and watching and thinking, oh my God, I am so going to be riveted by this, and sit there and watch this as it happens. So the idea that someone would suddenly be entertained by this same content just because it's now in an on-demand setting with some slightly dramatic ambient music behind it, I think they're missing a trick. And let's park that thought for a moment.
We are the people who protect the most vulnerable in society from harm, and yet we stand on the brink of...
Also, who are these people? Who are we hearing? We're not getting any sort of indication of who these people are. Maybe you're more intelligent than I am and you can detect who they are from their voices, very possibly. I don't watch the news every single day anymore. I made a point not to do that after COVID, and that's another subject for another day. But the point is, yes, I know some of the more familiar voices, but I don't know all these voices. So someone like me would need someone to say, by the way, this is, whoever. And that is missing from this. And it happens to be missing from a lot of podcasts where people assume you know who's talking.
Abandoning that role. The Rubicon was a very small stream, Mr. Speaker, but on the other side lies a very different world, a worse world, with a very different idea of human. I've completely changed my mind on this subject since I entered the House during the last century. And the reason for that is...
We are now 2 minutes and 40 seconds into this episode, and all we're hearing is out of context audio at the moment. So when I say out of context, you could argue it's in context, but not for me. I've not been given the context yet.
I've sat in my...
I'm going to be really interested to see how they bridge from this audio that is very much... it's a little bit vanilla, it's a bit pedestrian, the audio, because it's people talking in a very detached way about something quite impactful and emotional. I'm going to be very intrigued and interested to hear how the newsagents handle this when they start speaking.
Perhaps one day, Mr. Speaker, for myself.
I represent very many vulnerable people in marginalised communities. I cannot vote for a bill where I have
At least I think I recognise that voice. I think that's Diane Abbott. I could be wrong.
doubts about whether they will be protected.
Neither side has a monopoly on compassion. I personally will always be affected by watching my mum suffer at her death at the age I am now. So let us not think badly of one another's motives.
Okay, I think I've got an inkling of where the producer was going with this. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring a little bit of that emotional impact to it. But let's be honest, we don't care about these people because they don't care about us. So hearing some MP talking about their own experience with this topic is not going to have as much impact as I think the producer hopes it would have. That's certainly my inkling on that.
Let us instead be courteous and let us be curious.
Failure in palliative care and support is not a reason to continue. And I have a personal experience. Many of our members of this House will remember when my daughter was very ill a few years ago. I hope she forgives me for raising her personal situation in the House today.
It must be one of...
Again, I mean, you know, nothing personal against that lady, but number one, we don't even know who she is. The producer's assuming, based on what she said about those in the House will remember. I don't know who she is. Do you know who she is? Do you know who she's referring to? And how, if we don't know who they are, how can we get emotional with them about the topic?
One of the most painful decisions for most of the members of this House, the one that we're taking today. It certainly is for me.
Please be clear, friends, that whatever happens today, terminal people will still take their own lives.
We're now 4 minutes into this episode, and I've not yet heard how this whole topic is going to become relevant to me. I'm aware that this was something that was debated. I'm aware that this is a bill that has been passed. But how can I be emotionally involved and invested in this episode? Nothing has really drawn me into that point yet.
All we are deciding today is how.
My late mother lived with chronic illness all her life.
I mean, I'm at the point now where I'm going, I get it. I get it. When are we going to get into the theme of the episode?
And I knew that one day her pain would be too unbearable for her. But she did not let that limit her. She wanted to live. How can we be possibly satisfied that this bill would deliver equality and freedom in death when we do not yet have this in life?
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
Well, finally, we are now 4 minutes and 30 seconds into the episode, and the three newsagents have introduced themselves. Let's see how they play this.
And we're all back in the studio, just come back from the House of Commons. And that was a selection, as I'm sure you gathered, of just some of the contributions from MPs, both for and against the assisted dying legislation, which passed in the House of Commons on Friday afternoon. Again, just to remind you of the numbers, in the end, there was a majority of 55. A convincing majority, ayes 330 to the noes 275.
So we're getting all the facts. We're getting the stats of, you know, what happened.
And that is probably, although not certainly, a secure enough majority to see the assisted dying legislation, the terminally ill adults end-of-life bill, through the different stages of Parliament, although there is a long way, of course, to go, as the advocates of the bill said throughout. And as you heard there, the debate was emotional, often at times. It's a real cliche, but I think it is fair to say it was the Commons at its best. It was one of those votes where you genuinely didn't know which way it was going to go. You genuinely got the sense, I was in the chamber, you got the sense that there were MPs still making up their mind, listening to the contributions, and they were genuinely felt contributions.
This is another example of a podcast where it really thinks its value is in painting a picture for you on something they saw that they know you couldn't see, or that you didn't have a real world connection to. And for me, as someone that's in the business of storytelling and connecting listeners with brands and individuals, I know that's not enough. Who cares that they were there and they're able to paint this picture? I want to connect with them on a human level. And the way that I'm going to connect with them on a human level is the storytelling piece. So to open up with stats and facts and descriptions of emotions is really shortchanging the listener who wants to feel that connection, in my book.
On every side, but nonetheless, one side won out. And it was historic because the House of Commons has changed its mind. It's thought about this legislation before, as recently as 2015. It has always been taboo. It has always been something that Parliament has not been willing to confront and do. And now it has. And as I was saying at the top of the show, it is historic.
It's also probably going to be the most momentous piece of legislation that gets passed in this period of Keir Starmer's Labour government, even though the Labour government has nothing to do with it, because it was a free vote and people were free to go their own way. I mean, you were talking about watching it in the Commons. I was watching it on TV. And I think that that emotion got you. I mean, you know, triggering. I hate using that word, triggering, but it was, you know, my own mother's death with a terminal illness and all sorts of kind of decisions that we couldn't make came back to you. I think for everyone who took part.
Okay, so for me, something is really clear. they're burying the headline here, quite literally. So we've had Lewis doing his introduction with all of his stats, and, he's a young lad, so we would get that he is going to come with that approach because he probably doesn't have a great deal of experience personally with connecting his emotion with telling a story. John Sopel, on the other hand, has a lived experience, and he's sharing that. So my question is, why the hell did they not put that audio right near the beginning of the episode? Because I immediately feel connected to John with his story that he's sharing about his own experience with this very topic. That's something I can connect with. That's something I can relate to. I don't care about 330s. I don't care about historic monumental days, commons, any of that stuff. I care about the story. I care about the emotional attachment. For me, the editor has thought way too much about the historic audio and how to present that in a slightly creative way, rather than the fundamentals here, which is tell the story and connect to your listener, which John has done immediately.
They had a constituent, a family member, a loved one, a close friend, or whatever.
All they were thinking about what they themselves might do in that situation. That's why it's been such a kind of totalizing kind of debate, right? Because it is something that everyone knows will affect everyone and everyone's family.
I'm reminded of that phrase, people suddenly...
Oh, well, finally, we're now we're over 6 minutes in, and we're finally getting Emily. Nearly 7 minutes in, and we're getting Emily.
Which is slowly... and then all at once. You had all this debate, you had all the talking, you had those incredibly personal speeches, and then the vote ends up happening.
And on now we're getting Emily. Let me make something fundamentally clear, and this is relevant to all podcasters, this is relevant to all publishers, this is relevant to anybody that is in any way involved in the process of publishing a podcast. You have got a global production, The News Agents, pretty famous podcast actually, with a huge financial resource to it. And Emily Maitlis, who's in the centre of the artwork, because she is the most famous of the three news agents. I get that it was probably unavoidable, but she's on a Zoom call or a Teams call. She's on a recording through a video chat. Listen to the quality of the audio.
In a matter of seconds. And what was interesting this time was when it came back, there was absolute silence.
Do you hear the hiss? Are you telling me that with their financial resources, they couldn't clean that audio up a little bit more to make it sound more professional? Hiss! Hiss! On a global podcast for the main host. Hiss. I know of podcasts with not even a fraction of the financial resources that this podcast has that make audio sound so much crisper, so much better, because they make the effort to. It doesn't cost a fortune to remove some hiss from your podcast's host. There we go. That was the first edition of Unsolicited Podcast Feedback. Global will not care about my views, but hopefully you've learned something from this that you can apply to your own podcast productions. And we'll be back for another edition of this very soon. Please leave your feedback for me in the comments.